Russian defense minister urges Putin to prepare for full-scale nuclear tests because of U.S. We'll talk about this with Jason Smart, American political strategist. Jason, glad to see you and thank you for joining us.
It's always great to see you.
Jason, let's start with next news. Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán has traveled to Washington, D.C., where he is set to meet with U.S. President Donald Trump. One of the key topics of discussion will be the war in Ukraine. Before his departure, Orbán stated that new opportunities have opened up in Hungarian-American relations following President Trump's re-election. And he claimed the first 10 months of this year marked the initial stage during which we corrected everything that Hungary and Hungarian-American relations had suffered from during the Biden administration. What are the main strategic objectives of Viktor Orbán's visit to Washington, D.C., and how might they shape Hungarian-American relations? How significant is the discussion of the war in Ukraine for both Hungarian and U.S. foreign policy agendas during this meeting?
Well, first, we understand that Viktor Orbán has a close personal relationship with President Trump. That is something that predates with his current trip and his current administration of President Trump. But there's something else to this, which is that Hungary has played an increasingly important role for American conservatives. In the past few years, we've seen the rise of Hungarian lobbyism in the United States, but also American conservatives, conservative authors, as well as Christian authors, who are taking trips to Hungary, as well as moving to Hungary, because it now touts itself as being the country's most conservative and family value-oriented in Europe. And so taking advantage of this today, Hungary is able, or its president is able to take advantage of this because today Donald Trump views him as an ally, views him as someone who's aligned with Europe. Unfortunately, as we know, Viktor Orbán is somebody who routinely expresses pro-Russian talking points, and it's hard to say exactly how much that is something that influences the American leader. But either way, it is very clear that today this will probably be, yes, an advancement in Hungarian relations with the U.S., and this is something that Hungary itself, I would say that Orbán himself needs. Right now, he's facing elections. It looks like the polling numbers are not good for his party. Fidesz is for the first time, looks like it's down. And so he is trying to bolster his own image back in Hungary.
Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán plans to explain to U.S. President Donald Trump why his country depends on Russian energy supplies, according to Telex. As Orbán explained, since Hungary is a landlocked country, direct maritime deliveries are impossible, and the country therefore relies on overland pipelines to receive energy resources. He said that if Hungary does not adapt to the situation created by the U.S. sanctions on Russian oil companies, it will face an energy shortage. According to the Prime Minister, Americans need to be made to understand this in order to obtain some exemption from U.S. sanctions regarding the import of energy resources from Russia. What impact could potential exemptions or changes in U.S. sanctions have on regional energy markets and pipeline infrastructure? Your opinion?
Well, the reality of it is this, is that Hungary is always trying to find a way to justify what they're doing to support Russia. And the way that Orbán always does that is by saying what I'm doing is in interest of the Hungarian people, and their interest comes first. You know, Ukraine is unfortunate, but it's really not our problem. Our top priority is what is good for Hungarians. That's always the Prime Minister's talking points. That's routinely the way he behaves. Now, going ahead, I think it is realistic that the White House would give him some sort of a disposition from this specific sanction for this year. Because, once again, Orbán has a close relationship. But at the same time, that's not always been the case. We saw that the United States decided to keep sanctions on companies that worked with, for instance, Serbia, or with Vučić in Serbia, their leader. And that is a sign that the White House decided now it's out of second chances. It's out of the time of giving these companies the ability to keep cooperating with Russia, which I think really just speaks to the fact that President Trump is increasingly dissatisfied by how Vladimir Putin has treated these peace negotiations. Quite obviously, Putin is not serious about peace. I think it's, thank God, finally the White House is starting to understand that. But it's been a long time coming. But today, Hungary is going to do what it can to try to promote Russia's interest in Europe.
UK Defence Secretary John Healey remains convinced that U.S. President Donald Trump could persuade Kremlin dictator Vladimir Putin to begin peace talks regarding Ukraine. Quote from Healey during a flight from Norway to Paris, where he was traveling to meet France's new defense minister. President Trump is the figure that can bring Putin to the table, that can potentially deliver an end to the fighting. Healey stressed that the work of partners in the coalition of the willing is regularly refreshed so that we can genuinely feel we are ready at the point of peace whenever that comes to step in and help secure that. What specific factors lead UK Defence Secretary John Healey to believe that President Trump could persuade Vladimir Putin to engage in peace talks because the situation is difficult?
Well, I think that the reality is that most foreign leaders at this point would probably also say that simply because they don't want to upset Donald Trump. I don't know if it's necessarily a sign of good faith that they really believe that, or if it's simply because they know that Donald Trump has that objective and they don't wish to disagree with him publicly. But neither here nor there, I think there might be a second reason, which is perhaps even more clever. Just think about it logically. If you say that you support Donald Trump and you think that he'll be able to do it, that he'll be able to solve it, and then he fails, it means that it wasn't Donald Trump who was responsible. It was actually Putin. Because Donald Trump has the capacity, is what is being argued. And then that puts the blame on Putin. So if you're the UK and you'd like to see Donald Trump turn more against Putin, I think I'd phrase it just as the British have, because that's probably the most strategically wise way to try to get Trump closer to being on board with the right decision to back Ukraine and to stop the Putin regime.
I see that, yes, President Donald Trump has claimed that Russian dictator Vladimir Putin asked him to settle the war in Ukraine during their most recent phone conversation. Quote, I spoke to him, to Putin 2 weeks ago, and he said, we have been trying to settle that war for 10 years. We weren't able to do it. You got to settle. Trump added that he got these things settled in an hour, but did not specify what agreements he was referring to. What agreements, in your opinion?
Well, I think we have to be realistic. Listen, Vladimir Putin just said he's been trying to end this for a decade. He's been fighting a war illegally for a decade, and for 4 of those years, Donald Trump was the president. And now it's been another almost full year that he's been president again, so about 5 years. So about half the time that's been ongoing, Donald Trump was the president, and it seems very clear to me that Vladimir Putin never had an interest in ending this war. At no point has his desire to end the war been real or tangible. The U.S. Intelligence Committee does not believe, our U.S. Intelligence Committee does not believe that today Donald Trump is going to be able to end it, not because of him, but because Vladimir Putin doesn't want to end the war. It's really that simple. And so I think going ahead, what we can expect to see is more frustration from the White House, and unfortunately, probably more pressure on Ukraine to end the war, but it's really not in Ukraine's hands. This is something that the Kremlin is dictating.
Following another Russian attack on Ukraine's energy sector, President Volodymyr Zelensky called on allies to decide on the use of frozen Russian assets. He notes that the political will for this already exists, according to Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. As the president emphasizes, it was another restless night for Ukraine. Since yesterday evening, the Russians have been striking the Dnipropetrovsk region. They also attacked the Sumy, Kharkiv and Chernihiv regions. The targets are critical infrastructure. Zelensky notes that the continuation of Russian attacks indicates an insufficient level of international pressure on Moscow. What specific measures could allies take to utilize frozen Russian assets in support of Ukraine's defense and reconstruction efforts? How effective has international pressure on Moscow been so far, and what additional steps could increase its impact?
Well, I think realistically right now, the best thing that can happen is to give further arms to Ukraine and take off the limits, to not restrict how they're used, but to give the intelligence necessary to do more fine targeting within Russia, to hit not only the factories, not only the refineries, but to also go after the key players in Russia, to go after generals, to know in advance, which the Americans would know, when Russian senior military leaders will be meeting at a location or when they'll be traveling. I think going after them would be very wise, and I think it'd be very good for Ukraine. But another aspect of this, I think, as well, is the fact that we have to stop understanding this entire problem, this entire war, as being a two-sided situation. There's only one side that's an aggressor here, and that's Russia. And so today, the best thing we could do is help Ukraine to defend itself by defeating Russia. Because if we don't defeat Russia and this war continues, we can expect that the Russians' barbarism will only get worse. It will not get better. So if we really want to see an end to the war, the best thing that can happen is to help Ukraine defeat Russia.
About nuclear armed powers, the United States, Russia and China, the top 3 nuclear armed powers, have all test fired their intercontinental ballistic missiles. over the past year as the arms race among them looms, challenging global strategic balance and stability. The most recent ICBM test conducted by the U.S. on Wednesday with the launch of an unarmed Minuteman III missile aimed to evaluate the weapon system's reliability, readiness and accuracy, according to the U.S. Air Force Global Strike Command. How do recent ICBM tests by the U.S., Russia and China affect the current global strategic balance and perceptions of nuclear deterrence? What are the strategic objectives behind the U.S. Air Force's Minuteman III test, particularly regarding reliability, readiness, and accuracy?
Well, I have no doubt that the U.S. is ready and it's very accurate. What I would think is much more interesting, and we'll never probably know the real truth about, is how the Russians' tests are going. The Russians, every year a nuclear weapon takes millions of dollars to make sure that it's well taken care of, that it's well maintained, and that it'll work. The Russians have had about 35 years now since the collapse of the Soviet Union. We've noticed that their military has embezzled essentially all the money that came to it during the past quarter of a century. So today, will their nuclear weapons work and are they accurate? I would seriously doubt that. Just consider the fact of the amount of investment we've seen, what a disaster the military really is. Do you think that they're really spending the millions and millions necessary to test their weaponry to keep it up in the state-of-the-art fashion as the Americans would? I think it's very probable that they do not. But that's a secondary issue. I think where this is all going, though, is the fact that it's just, Russia wants to flex muscle. Talking about nuclear weapons, though, also serves a different purpose. And it's not really a reflection that they want to give to the United States or even to China. It might actually just be that domestically, for Vladimir Putin, it's important to remind people that he has this capacity, that he does have this at his disposal, these weapons. Because I think domestically there's increasing pressure on the Kremlin by forces there. And he now is in a position where he has to demonstrate strength.
We see that Russian Defense Minister Andrei Belousov has said that Russia needs to prepare for full-scale nuclear test in response to the actions of the United States. Belousov claimed that the U.S. is planning to deploy missiles in Europe and the Asia-Pacific region that would take just 6 to 7 minutes to reach central Russia from Germany. Belousov said that Moscow must maintain its nuclear potential and respond appropriately to Washington moves. He added that a possible U.S. withdrawal from the moratorium on nuclear testing could be a step towards the destruction of the global strategic stability system. How should, in general, the international community interpret Russia's statements about preparing full-scale nuclear tests as genuine policy, strategic posturing, or dramatic theater, as always?
Well, I think it's theater as always. I mean, listen, going back to Khrushchev, the Russians have been talking about nuclear weapons and making threats. But there's something else that's really important to note here, which is the fact that given the fact that we have our nuclear submarines all over the world and very close to Russia, I don't know why he'd be so alarmed by this. We know very well that the Russians most likely have nuclear weapons in Kaliningrad, so they are on the border of Europe. So I think it's just sort of, it's typical of Russia, this sort of arrogance to insist that what the U.S. is doing or NATO countries are doing is wrong, where they themselves engage in the exact same behavior. So I'm not worried about it at all. It's just typical posturing from the Russians, who always fall back on nuclear weapons when they're out of options. And today, they're increasingly out of options.
How effective is nuclear intimidation as a tool for influencing U.S. or NATO decisions, and does it risk backfiring?
I think it's totally ineffective. And I think that it probably was actually in the previous administration. I mean, we did hear the White House, when Jake Sullivan was the head of National Security Council under Biden, routinely talk about the fear of escalation, that we had to stop escalation. And I think that was probably one of the most foolish and horrible things during that administration. Because the fact is this, is that Russia is always going to insist that they can escalate, that they will escalate. But we've seen during this war, despite all these threats, despite the fact that every couple of weeks, Dmitry Medvedev shows up to talk about destroying the West, they haven't done it yet. The reality is that this is all for show. This is all just a joke, and that's why this should not be taken seriously. And unfortunately, the Russians have learned that the West is very quick to get upset, to become concerned, and to respond with fear when it sees these things like the rocket test in Russia. But the reality of the matter is this, is that Russia today is a country that is a basket case. It's becoming increasingly destabilized. And for Putin to think that this is something that Donald Trump would react well to, I'm not a huge fan of the president by any means, of the U.S. president. That being said, I think that he does have a tendency, if somebody tells him, I'm going to do this, trying to intimidate him, he takes the other extreme. He doesn't back down. He might do something more extreme to make his point. And I think that's very realistic. And in this case, I think that it's going to be very difficult for the Russians to intimidate the Americans.
And also about what is happening in the United States of America, the federal government remains shut down in what is now the longest shutdown in U.S. history. Many federal workers have missed their paychecks, including air traffic controllers who are working unpaid. One air traffic controller is warning over the upcoming Thanksgiving holiday season. We could see the worst day of travel in the history of flight if the shutdown doesn't end soon. What concrete steps is the administration considering to resolve the government shutdown and mitigate its growing economic and social impact?
Well, unfortunately, it appears that the White House is not very keen to end the shutdown. But it also doesn't seem that there's a lot of leadership on the Democratic side in Congress that's working to end this. The fact of the matter is that both sides right now believe it's politically opportunistic to continue the shutdown. For their own reasons, for totally separate reasons. One side believes, the Democrats don't believe it would be good to agree with the president. They think it's better to have the standoff, to stand up to him, would be the perception that they're trying to communicate. And in the eyes of the U.S. president, he believes that he has the Democrats in a weak position, that they will look like they were supporting things that the American public does not support. So ultimately, they're both playing political games. And it is, of course, unfortunate that that does harm common Americans. But that's a very sad, tragic state of American politics today.
What are the long-term implications of this record-breaking shutdown for public trust and federal institutions?
Well, we've seen that trust in the federal institutions has declined over the past several years, and it probably won't get better with this. I mean, both political parties in the U.S. are not popular. The Democrats have reached actually their base low, I think, for the past few decades, just recently. And that's against Donald Trump, who's the least popular president that the U.S. has had. So the fact that they're both doing so badly in the polling is indicative of the fact that Americans aren't happy with the opportunities that they've been given. And I, have no preference on either side. I am not trying to put out something in favor or against either one. But I think if someone looks at this neutrally from a distance, they realize that for the average American citizen, they don't understand what the shutdown's about. Fundamentally, they don't understand what the key problems are or what the differences are. But they realize that this shows just a total lack of good management or skill to have the country reach this point of breaking down. And this is not the first time, but it's something that's increased over the past decade.
How might a prolonged U.S. government shutdown affect U.S. foreign aid programs, including assistance to Ukraine? Could the temporary suspension of some U.S. government functions delay military or financial support to Ukraine amid ongoing security challenges?
I mean, the embassy in Kiev right now isn't working. The employees are sitting at home. So I guess we could say, yes, directly there has been a result of this, that the U.S., a lot of the workers that are working on things that are important for Ukraine are not working. Not all of them. I mean, many of them who are considered to be important for specific features of the government are working. But many of the people who have jobs that are considered to be secondary, not a priority for national security, they are quite literally sitting at home. So that is unfortunate because at this point in time, obviously, Ukraine needs all the help it can get.
Jason, thank you so much for this important and interesting conversation. Thank you for supporting Ukraine and Ukrainian people. Jason Smart, American political strategist, was with us today. Thank you for watching. Please share this interview and continue supporting Ukraine, and see you.
Thank you.